Carl was my own teacher and mentor, spirit guy.
Don't say how long ago, it'll reveal both our ages.
Okay. I won't say how long ago. Some years ago at DU when I was an undergraduate, and I've come to refer to him as the resident prophet at DU. We have one here at UCD. He's always on the cutting edge of development, and he's going to share with us today a discovery here, a little known prophet, can we call him that, a philosopher, French philosopher, Gilles Deleuze, in relationship to Derrida. So we're very thrilled to have Dr. Raschke here. Thanks so much for coming.
You're welcome. Just kind of truth in advertising a little bit. I told Robert that I was going to talk about Deleuze because that's kind of where I am now, which is true. However, I realized before I could say what I wanted to say about Deleuze, I had to say something about Derrida because that's sort of my MO right now is saying, you know, we've all got to get over Derrida and get on to Deleuze. But it also realized that it wouldn't make much sense of why I'm really pushing Deleuze right now until I kind of talked about what we have to say about Derrida, in particular the later Derrida, and then I realized we have a time limit, and I have a 24-page paper here, which is actually the opening chapter of my new book, which is about 90% finished, which I hope to finally get out this summer. It's called Indian Territory, Religious Theory After Postmodernism. And that's a kind of sort of ironical title. What comes after postmodernism is kind of a question, everybody, including my aunt, is, just tired of hearing about postmodernism. Now that where it's really hot in Bible Belt evangelical Christian circles, it's time to move on. But again, I'm not trying to periodize this or say, okay, we need now a next sort of epoch we're moving into, because after all, postmodernism is still a term that hasn't really been decoded yet. It's a term that really it doesn't refer or even connote so much as it kind of lays out a sort of topos, a kind of no man's land, or what I call Indian territory. I'll talk about that a little bit later, why I use that phrase. It's actually a kind of play on Derrida's Deleuze's key concepts of territorialization and deterritorialization. And ultimately what I'm arguing in this book is Deleuze's whole way of going about the theory of signs and signification through this metaphor of deterritorialization really gets a lot more to the heart of what is happening in postmodern philosophy than was ever intended or envisioned in Derridian deconstruction. So let me begin. What this first chapter is called is Derrida and the Return of Religion. It's going to be published in the next edition of the Journal for Cultural and Religious Theory. Not because I wanted to do it, but they wanted me to do it. So I said, well, okay, you can have this chapter. But maybe when the book comes out, everything will kind of fall in place and be all connected. After postmodernism, what do we say about the religious? Do we have a religion without religion, as Jack Caputo has suggested, or a distinctively Derridian religiosity as well as theology that is manifesting in some quarters? Or is something quite unanticipated, perhaps unthought, as Heidegger would say, en route? As a surfeit of scholarship has reminded us in recent years, the postmodern turn that began a quarter century ago has opened wide the question of religion in ways that are even inconceivable even in the previous generation. As the prophet of postmodernism, Derrida has spoken profusely, if not Delphically, about the return of religion, as if the religious and the philosophical constituted some strange sort of sub-intelligible economy that has, through the unyielding pressure of textual deconstruction, slithered forth into the light of theory. The religious in Derrida turns out to be its own kind of supplement, not the supplement of writing, but the supplement of what Derrida himself calls Latinity. And here I'm talking about Derrida's famous essay that came out of his conversations back in the 90s on the Isle of Capri was published as Faith and Knowledge, is now main essay, anchor essay in the book of Derrida on religion. What does Derrida mean by the Latin as a metonym for the religious? According to Derrida, the Latin is the word for the West. The Latin is what overreaches with its sumptuous signatures of power and meaning. It is the perfection of the organizational, a vast economy of codings, as well as a re-territorialized, in Deleuze's sense, system of administration necessary for the expansion of a planetary socio-political apparatus. To be religious is to participate in an impersonal and invisible strategy of pacification, again Derrida's term, toward which the Roman Empire, with its brutal politics of deportation and detribalization, always strove. Today, this detribalization proceeds not so much by the tramp of legions and the force of arms as by commerce, exchange, and communications technology. Politics depends on the mobilization of innumerable private aspirations and patterns of consumer behavior through a manufacture of virtual values of identity which, as Baudrillard tells us, are just as real and motivating as the old order of ideals. In Faith and Knowledge, Derrida refers to this postmodern world historical movement as global Latinization, or alternately, the new war of religion. The field of this war, or of this pacification, is henceforth without limit. All the religions, their centers of authority, their religious cultures, states, nations, or ethnic groups, they have unequal access to each other. One that is immediate and potential without limit to the same world market. I'm sorry, that's a quote from Derrida himself. The production of religion, Derrida says, goes hand in hand with, quote, the pledge of faith, the guarantee of trustworthiness, end quote. That is necessary to underwrite, quote, the fiduciary experience presupposed by all production of shared knowledge, the testimonial performativity engaged in all techno-scientific performance as in the entire capitalistic economy indissociable, end quote. As in old Rome, the notion of religion functions as an aggregate signifier for the rebinding, that is, religio, together of previously profuse and dissociated particularities of faith and devotion, with their own indigenous or territorial characteristics into a grand ideology of unity and diversity, where the principle of integration is the divinization of the political, i.e. emperor worship. If the term postmodern originally meant, as it did for Charles Jenks, who really popularized the term, the wild eclecticism and hybridization of architectural styles, it now connotes a market-driven syncretism on a global scale of religious simulacra that have been long stripped of their content, of their original civic implications. But what is the agency that rebinds the simulacra of the gods in our new Rome, our post-Enlightenment imperium of techno-scientific rationality in which the religious returns? According to Derrida, quote, religion today allies itself with tele-technoscience, to which it reacts with all its forces. It is, on the one hand, globalization. It produces, weds, exploits the capital and knowledge of telemediazation. Neither the trips and global spectacularizing of the Pope, nor the interstate dimensions of the Raschke affair, nor planetary terrorism would be otherwise possible at this rhythm, and we would multiply such indications ad infinitum. But at the same time, religion declares, quote, war against that which gives it this new power only at the cost of dislodging it from all its proper places, in truth from place itself, from the taking place of its truth, end quote.
The new war of religion is between the Enlightenment force of globalization and telemediazation on the one hand, and the reactive force of faith, which is a singularity and has its own place of truth. The new war of religion is a profound struggle between faith and reason, but not in the classic sense at all. While the classic scuffle was between the doctrinal formulation of religious intuitions and revelations, it could not be reconciled with either philosophical or plain experience, to use the argument of the Enlightenment. The new battle between the techno-rationalizing war machine, that's Deleuze's phrase, that deterritorializes all significations of faith in the service of a global consumer regnum and the faith's own reactive violence. Faith defends its own, particularly situation against the encroachment of this regnum by fighting for the purity and sanctity of its language and authority, a process that has come to be called fundamentalism. And I think this observation of Derrida, which is kind of elaborated, paraphrased by myself, is very trenchant in light of the election of Pope Benedict XVI and what he represents and what he comes from. These fundamentalisms, and I'm not using this word in the classic or the popular sense of Christian evangelical fundamentalism, these fundamentalisms or foundationalisms, which have resisted encroachment, sometimes for generations, by carving out enclaves of belief and practice with entry signs that read "Do Not Disturb," suddenly under the constant and mounting pressure of global Latinization turned militant and aggressive. This kind of reactivity has proven especially potent in the fundamentalization of Islam, inasmuch as Islam historically, far more than the Church with its ideal of Christendom, has opposed all empires with its own opposing regnum, the Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam. Although Derrida, for whatever reason, seems to avoid he is without questioning assessing much the same phenomenon. Quote, this peculiar religiosity is obliged to ally the reactivity of the primitive and archaic return, both to obscurantist dogmatism and to hypercritical vigilance. The machines it combats by striving to appropriate them are also machines for destroying historical tradition. Again, this whole notion of the war machine, the kind of automatism of desire is very pertinent. Continue with the quote. They can displace the traditional structures of national citizenship. They tend to efface both the borders of the state and the distinctive properties of languages, end quote. They are global in their universalistic and anti-historical reach without any Latin tendency to assimilate and incorporate. Instead, they become contrarian war machines of their own, riding roughshod over all historicity and cultural multiplicity and subtlety. The fundamentalist war machine is quintessentially a jihad of deterritorialized faith nomads exploding, like the Islamic armies after the death of Muhammad, across the vast and crumbling empire of techno-scientific rationality. But what causes this war to happen in the first place? What sets off the fundamentalist nomad explosion? Derrida answers the question by reviving Henri Bergson, whom increasingly we're beginning to identify as a deep source of postmodernism. And of course, that's because we're reading all these French thinkers, and they say, hey, I took it all from Bergson. In his two sources of morality and religion, Bergson traces the problem to the dichotomy within the experience of time itself, the spatio-mechanistic, calculable sense of clock time, in French temps, and the undivided movement of interior consciousness, durée. Although Derrida is highly elliptical and frequently confusing in his allusions to Bergson, his citation of two sources along with Kant's religion within the limits of reason alone as the two works that allow us to still, quote, think religion in the daylight of today without breaking the philosophical tradition, end quote, is extremely instructive. Both books are incidental reflections, much like Derrida's own essay on faith and knowledge, by seminal philosophers in the mature phase of their careers on the matter of the religious. More importantly, they are prospectuses on how to think the religious. The return of the religious is the occasion to think the religious. But the phenomenon of religion, that which appears as a conundrum for thinking, is inevitably schizoid. It is a double stratum because of its double source. The religious reveals itself as a quasi-spontaneous automaticity, as irreflective as reflex, end quote. quote, repeats again and again the double movement of abstraction and attraction that at the same time detaches and reattaches to the country, the idiom, the literal, or to everything confusedly collected today under the terms identity or identitarian. In two words, that which at the same time expropriates and reappropriates, deracinates and re-racinates, expropriates according to a logic that we will have to formalize, end quote. Derrida's strangely un-Derridian discourse in this inaugural essay on faith is slyly recrafted, if not directly lifted, from Deleuze, who has bequeathed to us a analysis of philosophical change and the evolution of concepts derived from a metaphorized history of the millennial conflict between sedentary civilizations and wandering pastoral peoples. The logic Derrida references here is the same Deleuze unfolds in 1,000 Plateaus. Religion returns only because it is rhizomic. It is a constant pressure beneath the surface of the deep. Its double sourcing becomes a double sentencing of what Deleuze understands as territorialized self-identity and deterritorialized mobile or nomadic signifiers that are in flight toward uncharted destinations in the history of thought. Deterritorialization is what Derrida characterizes as deracination. The modern era of enlightenment constitutes a progressive deterritorialization of the existential situation of faith, beginning with the 18th century critique of Christianity, but enlarging itself through the colonial predations of Europe during the 19th century and culminating in the grand subsumption of all the world's sacred texts and traditions under the rubric of scientific or theoretical study of religion. And of course, what's apropos here is Jonathan C. Smith's remark that religious studies is the kind of quintessential colonial discipline. The compression of religiosity within the limits of reason alone generates a reactivity that Kant himself grasped, but did not think through as radical evil. Radical evil for Derrida as well as for Kant is the pure disclosure of difference within the Enlightenment project. Yet this disclosure is only made possible by the deracination of the faith act of signification, by its reterritorialization as a conceptual item for analysis and comparison, or as a datum for global theology. All interfaith initiatives or global theological agendas are efforts to smooth over the sharp edges of religious difference, to domesticate them and make them susceptible to techno-rational intervention. Our so-called fundamentalisms thus are not conservative, but genuinely revolutionary in their intention and thrust. Altogether, they constitute something much more than a collective quasi-Freudian return of the repressed within the economy of consciousness. All fundamentalisms are anathema to the partisans of enlightenment because they connote a deterritorialization of those faith codings that had already been reterritorialized as a general concept of the religious. They disclose a differencing that is ineradicable for the situation of faith. Their deterritorialization is also a de-Latinization, a barbarian incursion across borders, a breaching of the limina. And what the limina were the boundaries of the Roman Empire. And I was just telling people here when I gave a talk years ago at the University of Frankfurt, we were talking sort of about limina because Frankfurt is right on the ancient limit of the Roman Empire. And one of the German professors there who didn't like the postmodern turn I was advocating, this was 1986, I think, he said, "Yep, I can tell you aren't a barbarian, you're from the other side of the limit." It's possible because the theory of the postmodern is impossible. As Hans Bertrand's in his History of the Postmodern has shown, the phrase has a broad extension. In effect, there are multiple postmodernisms. Postmodernism, he argues, is several things at once. In fact, Bertrand distinguishes as many as 4 postmodernisms. It refers, first of all, to a complex of anti-modernist artistic strategies which emerged in the 1950s and developed momentum in the course of the 60s. These developments and strategies are confusing enough. But at a second level of conceptualization, we find confusions, Bertrand says. Here, postmodernism has been defined as the attitude of the new sensibility of the 1960s social and artistic avant-garde, a sensibility that is eclectic and radically democratic, rejecting the exclusivist and repressive character of liberal humanism and the institutions with which it identifies that humanism. According to Bertrand, we may identify this phenomenon as a type of political postmodernism that was first identified in the mid-60s by the literary critic Leslie Fiedler. Then in the 1970s, postmodernism was absorbed into the stream of French post-structuralism. Bertrand names this movement post-structuralist postmodernism, which is really what in philosophy we spend most of our time talking about. Though most of the cultural conservatives and critics of everything post-60s use the term postmodernism really to refer to, post-60s culture. The second moment in post-structuralist postmodernism, according to Bertrand, quote, derives from Foucault, to a much lesser extent, Lacan. It belongs to the 1980s rather than the 70s, although it is difficult to pinpoint interference. The focus of the second phase was the workings of power and its relationship to production and maintenance of knowledge. At this level, much of the neo-Marxist or cultural Marxist rhetoric of political postmodernism in the 60s, particularly its critique or unmasking of ideological postures and formations, became fused with the more theoretical innovations of French conceptual postmodernism. The long-standing domestic partnership between Marxist activism and the French intelligentsia contributed strongly to this. Postmodernism, Bertrand writes, means and has meant different things to different people at different conceptual levels, rising from humble literary critical origins in the 50s to a level of global conceptualization in the 80s. But if a postmodern theory of religion is impossible, a theory of religion after postmodernism is altogether conceivable. After postmodernism, have we not reached the apogee of the postmodern turn? Has not the whole world turned postmodern? Since the expression postmodern connotes less a moment than a departure, a line of flight in Deleuze's sense, the sense of the post or the after. Since postmodernism itself can be considered an imminent sort of eschatology, proclaiming the end of all that went before it, a declaration about what comes after postmodernism is curious, to say the least. However, it is only after postmodernism the religious theory can be imagined. Even if a prospectus for such a theory will take many generations to survey and lease out. The religious theory itself requires the end of postmodernism because what has come to be regarded as postmodernist theory has not been able to emancipate itself from the Enlightenment project which both spawned and spurred it. In many respects, the era of postmodernism can be seen not as a new dawn or a new era, but as a shimmering and multi-hued sunset of the modernist period. Bertrand ends his searching and detailed account of the emergence of the postmodernist theme by epitomizing it as a full manifestation of the deeper contradictory impulses of the Enlightenment. The spirit of the Enlightenment is always both universalistic and anti-representational, according to Bertrand. And I think this is borne out by the latest trend in, quote, postmodernism. I just came back a few days ago from Postmodernism, Religion and Culture Conference at Syracuse with the latest hot item, Alain Badiou, who was the keynote speaker, and Zizek, which was quite a trip to see them on the same stage together. But the interesting thing was all of them were talking about a search for a new universalism within what they call the singularity of the event. It sounded kind of strange. It made me realize that in some ways we're all, sort of genetically embedded children of the Enlightenment, and as philosophers it's hard to get away from this. That's why you had to read Deleuze. Has no apologies for crypto-universalistic strategy whatsoever. It's purely about the singular. The universalistic thrust centered on advancing of the Enlightenment centered on advancing the radical ideals of democracy, liberty, equality, and fraternity, or sorority. Political postmodernism, therefore, leveraged this agenda in a multitude of ways, attempting to make the Enlightenment live up to its promises. A wide swath of ideological critiques with their own revisionist histories. Feminism, ethnic historiography, gay and lesbian studies, post-colonial writing, inter alia served to foster a theoretical framework for social and political emancipation. Inherent in this method of ideological analysis was a powerful distrust of the classical theory of representation, which political thought after Marx instinctively understood as saturated with the interests of particular classes, groups, or social formations. Anti-representationalism or deconstructionism, therefore, was born of the very hermeneutics of suspicion which the Enlightenment and its self-reflexive approach to philosophy inaugurated by Descartes had engendered. Anti-representationalism was motivated by the emancipatory ideal of the 18th century. Yet it came to be a two-edged sword that also undercut the universalistic claims of reason on which emancipatory politics were originally founded. The result was a politics of pure differentiation that could not brook any theoretical perspective, that might somehow compromise the subtle hegemonic intrusion of one interest-driven party into the cultural sphere of the other. In the language of Levinas, the side of the same could under no circumstances be drawn across the face of the other. If the universalism of the Enlightenment had already been exposed in numerous instances as false consciousness, the rough particularism that was the teleological outcome of the insuperable postmodernist différende, Lyotard's phrase, was even more devastating. Postmodern theory, notes Bertens, became myopically concerned with fragmentation, and the emancipatory function of postmodernist thought became self-limiting. The impossibility of religious theory in the postmodern epoch is well nigh self-evident. The anti-representationalist critique of all grand theory made its initial impact in the 1960s as a succession of religious from theological studies. While the separation was also propelled by an increasing tension between the academic as opposed to the sectarian approach to religion, the presumed universalism of the Christian faith on which theology was based met with increasingly militant skepticism. However, theology is always carried and in some fashion continues to bear the theoretical burden of religious studies. While philosophical, psychological, sociological, and anthropological research have all trafficked with the concept of the religious, it is theology alone that has internalized the aim of what was once termed the science of religion, even if its agenda was always preservationist or apologetic to varying degrees, seeking to uphold the primacy of a specific discursive formation that might at the same time be confessionally sound and objectively coherent. It is no accident that Kantianism, with the idea of a synthetic a priori, which the neo-Kantians construed as implying a religious a priori, mapped out the fundamental theoretical matrix in the 19th century for the academic study of religion. Religious theory at the outset was not easily distinguishable from theological thinking. Hegelianism, with its notion of the concrete universal, later gave impetus to the elaboration of both a non-dogmatic theological program that extended well into the 20th century, as well as to a more comprehensive program of Religionswissenschaft, which served as the framework for the theoretical analysis of religion. The crisis of theory, on the other hand, can be traced to the collapse of the universalistic construct, and thus the pretension of Wissenschaft, under the pressures of decolonialization. The proximity between the evolution of the religious sciences and the ideological reach of the European colonial administrations has been identified and discussed by an assortment of recent writers. Charles Long has located the crisis historically with the rise and fall of the Aryan myth, on which we are finding the justification of colonialism far more dependent than the theology of Christian dominion. So much of religious theory harks back to the work of Max Muller, who by Long's reckoning developed an intricate, quote, avowal of the Aryan myth, while pushing his claims concerning the prestige of Sanskrit in general, and the Indo-European languages in particular, all the while attempting to, quote, understand myth through an analysis of the history and evolution of language and the editing of non-Western sacred books, end quote. The formalization of the principle of religious alterity through the writing of a history of religions over against Christian Heilsgeschichte, a position which the postmodern takes as a given rather than a dilemma, actually has its origins in the colonial intention of discovering a racial and linguistic depth grammar for religious statements that can be considered either non-theological or opaquely proto-theological. As Long points out, the earliest forays into the nascent field of religious studies were concentrated on philology. The discovery of a root language for Europeans led to the premise that beneath the basal syntax of the multifarious Indo-Aryan dialects lurked a hidden ethno-spirituality. The Roman sensus communis of language and style ultimately led, according to Long, to a sensus numinus. At its birth, religious studies signified, therefore, an Aryanization of the universalistic theology of Kant and the Aufklärung, which in Long's view represented a counterblow of German Romanticism against the Enlightenment. German culture had been marginalized in 18th century letters, according to Long, and the Aryan innovation proved to be a comeuppance. German thought in the 19th century transformed Kantian pure reason into the historicist, perspectivalist, and ethno-particularist forms of critical rationality that are nowadays the benchmarks of stereotypical postmodernism. Kant's transcendental categories became Weber's ideal types. Empirical constructs regarding religious practices, traditions, and institutions, as well as textual corpuses, that seemed to differentiate the colonial experience of cultural diversity while more covertly managed to subsume them in their entirety as a concealed unity. This unity was not theological so much as it was gnosiological, and it gradually became codified in the deference of the Teutonophiles to the ancient Vedas, composed in the modern Aryan language of Sanskrit. The Vedas were believed to contain the cultural secrets of not only Nietzsche's nomadic blonde beasts, but of religion as a pre-linguistic and archaic pressure within the economy of civilized signification. The strangeness, the Unheimlichkeit, to use the terminology of the spirit, that had been dispossessed, repressed, and expatriated by the Enlightenment, only to return, as Freud and Derrida would later tell us, in some indwelling yet strictly eschatological or messianic sense. The Aryan mystique, along with the corollary myth of Vedic profundity, of course, was popularized and spiritualized through the Theosophical movement, which generated its own long-held anxiety of influence for religious studies. The Vedic side of the aboriginal and its imminent return is more than what Foucault would term an artifact of cultural archaeology. It is a side of what Zizek, borrowing from Lacan, terms the real, or the real, quote, overflowing reality. The return of the real is the key to what we phenomenologically envision as the religious, because it is the fullness of half-forgotten and repressed remembrance as well as ancestral consciousness. Ancestral worship has multivalent significations, according to Zizek. Although Zizek is not very interested in the religious qua religious, his effort to operationalize Lacan through a psychosemiotic rendering of popular culture draws us intimately into the sphere of what theologically derived theory understands as religion. Zizek speaks not of religion, but of the real. In a curious fashion, the real is rendered as the religious through its formation in the Lacanian model as an overdetermined and excessive apparition of the signified. Quote, I'm quoting from Zizek. The ambiguity of the Lacanian real is not merely a non-symbolized kernel that makes a sudden appearance in the symbolic order in the form of traumatic returns and answers. The real is at the same time contained in the very symbolic form. The real is immediately rendered by this form, end quote. Lacan, in his seminar Encore, Zizek says, quote, surprisingly rehabilitates the notion of the sign conceived precisely in its opposition to the signifier, as preserving the continuity with the real, end quote. The articulation of signifiers reveals the impossibility of condensing the real into that order of articulation. Signifier coalesces into the sign, which was heretofore prediscursive and its own form of transcendence, a pure jouissance, but is now transmuted into, again, Zizek's language, materialized enjoyment. The sign is opposed to the hyperbolic Zarathustrian dance of signification, and the real are conjugate in this sense with each other. The sign is neither apophatic, that is, purely negative in Derrida's sense, nor apophantic in Heidegger's sense, revelational. It is a sudden unveiling, though in a quite ordinary matter, an apocalypsis. The Derridian play of signifiers are in truth merely an elaborate foreplay to the desperate consummation of desire in the sighting, I've had a pun there, S-I-G-H-T-I-N-G, and the citing or citing, C-I-T-I-N-G, is something bizarre and completely non-eidetic that counts as a phenomenon. For Zizek, the difference between modernism and postmodernism is that the former preserves the modesty of philosophy. From Kant onward, it refuses to reveal the thing. Quote, the lesson of modernism is that the structure of the intersubjective machine works as well if the thing is lacking, if the machine revolves around an emptiness. The postmodernist reversal shows the thing itself as the incarnated, materialized emptiness, end quote. The thing is the black hole in the cosmos of signification, always shadowing and ultimately swallowing up the symbolized objects of desire. Das Ding is always a non-dialectalizable inert presence, according to Zizek. It has always been there, but it has remained barely noticed, chiefly because the unconscious is not properly formatted. If we were to think theologically in a strained Zizekian fashion, we will realize quickly that the religious, with all our God talk and ontological or meontological or negative ontology, is what we truly desire. But for Zizek, that means the secularization of religious theory. In Lacan, the real returns, not as it did for Freud, as the expression of a hydraulically repressed instinct, nor as it seems to do for Derrida as an autoimmune mechanism of pacifying or a global Latinizing the chaos of virulent archaisms. For Lacan, the real returns is a syncopated rhythm involving the neonatal and linguistic or symbolic registers. As was the case with Peirce, there can be no thought, even in the psychoanalytical sense, without the triadic dynamism that we call signification. Lacan never developed or attempted to develop a theory of religion, nor does Zizek, as cultural theoretical mouthpiece for Lacan, make such a gesture. Yet in blazing this trail, we can begin with the Lacanian premise that all our theorizing must flow out of the movement of signifying praxis, when language begins to reveal what filters through the screen of language, when the negative is disclosed not as Derrida's formalized absent presence, but as the rupture of the real by the semiotic process. In this revealing rupture, the real continues to return as the symbolic codes that overflow the logic of discourse, that imminently and interminably continue to signify. By drawing on the Freudian rule of free association, Lacanian analysis allows the unconscious to be structured progressively as an intricate and eminently fruitful language. Quote, the more we speak inconsistently, the more we express and reveal our own desire, says Lacan. Lacanian analysis is in reality a form of couch semiotics, an intersubjective eliciting of the signifying relationships, including the dyads, polarities, symmetries, axes, and the paradigmatic as well as syntagmatic transformations. This is all talk from structural linguistics, that make the unconscious objective to both analyst and analysand. Both structuralism and post-structuralism have rightly recognized that meaning lies in the production of difference, in the generation of a negative logical space that becomes the occasion for the play of theory that is never totalizing but always open texture. Such a redistribution of logical values is analogous to the dissemination of aesthetic values, especially luminosity that began with Rembrandt and gave impotence to modernism and painting. It is the crucial project behind what Derrida later named deconstruction. By the way, I'll let you in on a little secret. People don't realize this. And I even hit Jack Caputo with this about a year and a half ago, who in turn, called up Derrida and said, is this true? I found the first real philosophical use of the word deconstruction. And it's in a 1945 essay by Georges Bataille. And it means essentially what Derrida meant by it. Religious theory on the grander scale, but structural analysis, or even the kind of radical historicization and temporalization of structural analysis that characterize the post-structuralist movement, comes up short when we are confronted with the task of religious theory. The reason is simple. Religious theory on the grander scale we envision requires a detextualization of religion, a department from the grammatological model, which Derrida ironically is engraved with invisible ink, to which the classic theological and hermeneutical disciplines have always been joined at the hip. Negative theology remains theology, because even the search for dark windows positioned throughout the text cannot be separated from the text. What would a detextualization of the concepts of religion involve? By no means can it amount to a return to the social sciences, particularly the sorts of anthropological or typological studies that sprang up in the late 19th century as a way of coding the bureaucratic information and intelligence data of Europe's colonial empires, and finally reached a critical mass that jump-started the growth of the field of religious studies now over a generation ago. The tension between the empiricism and sociological positivism of the so-called human sciences and the self-regarding and in many respects self-referential tendencies of theological inquiry must be overcome, although few have attempted to confront, let alone take the challenge. The custom of dismissing theology out of hand by specialized scholars of religion has never had the consequences intended. Instead of promoting a habit of theoretical inquiry, it has reinforced a methodological naivete as well as an extreme crazy quilt of subdisciplinary priorities and topics, with hardly any consciousness of the broader and more momentous question of religion in this era of global Latinization. One of the major problems with the balkanized field of religious studies is that it proves to be powerless in the face of a planetary return of religion in a global political sense. In all fairness to Derrida's efforts to raise a more encompassing religious question cannot be construed as any kind of preface to theory. The Capri conversations have been overemphasized by many admirers of Derrida, starved for some set of cues that will carry them into the realm of religious discourse in a more concrete manner than Caputo offered in his groundbreaking work on Derrida's spirituality, what the former felicitously dubbed religion without religion. Like Deleuze before him and a majority of French post-structuralists, Derrida has and acknowledges a serious debt to Bergson. Derrida makes the point about Bergson as a starting point in asking what it would mean to think religion. Quote, to hold that religion is properly thinkable and even thinking is neither seeing nor knowing nor conceiving, is still to hold it in advance and respect. Thus over short or long the affair is decided, end quote. Derrida goes on to say that his project for thinking religion is drawn from, quote, the famous conclusion of the two sources, the memorable words that the essential function of the universe is a machine for making of gods, which, by the way, is also the metaphor that Deleuze took from his desiring machine. You know, the one thing I've noticed, the more you read French philosophy, is the more you realize that they joyously plagiarize each other, you know, going back generations, you know, without any apology for it. You know. Derrida, of course, in his advancement of the metaphor of the religious machine, is playing on Bergson's intuition of a mystical machine that would overcome all techno-scientific mechanism and defeat all forms of modernist materialism, including dialectical materialism. He is also transposing into the post-structuralist idiom the early Heideggerian dictum that in an age of alienation and dehumanization, along with the absorption of metaphysics by the techno-scientific attitude, quote, only a God can save us. And he is building on Deleuze and Guattari's metaphor of the desiring machine that they introduce in the post-structuralist assault on Oedipus as a metonym for the technologico-materialist repression of the richness of the imaginable. Contra Deleuze and Guattari, it is not the instinctual but the religious that implies the ultimate desiring machine. Religion is inherently machinic, as a phenomenon of a technology-driven worldwide resurgence of fundamentalism indicates. A machine-like reactivity to the machine is as automatic and thus machinal, Derrida says, as life itself. Such an internal splitting which opens distance is also peculiar or proper to religion. Appropriate religion for the proper, appropriating religious indemnification to all forms of property, from the linguistic idiom in its letter to the blood and soil, the family, and the nation. Sorry, that's Derrida at his worst or best. I don't know if it's translator in Faith and Knowledge, but sometimes it's just purely, you know, unintelligible. That's the quote. The Capri conversations are maddeningly disjointed and errant, and they underscore Derrida's attempt to struggle with a subject that in many ways is more daunting than the previous efforts to deconstruct the discursivity of Western philosophy. He is, in effect, reviving the late Heideggerian project of rethinking the destiny of being through technology. But in this context, the question of ontology becomes the question of religion. Religion's resurgence in the world the French is déferlement, Derrida insists, is bound up with the technological transformation and convergence of societies, cultures, nations, and tokens of communication and exchange. It is like a wave that builds and gathers momentum from its resistance. Quote, religion today allies itself with teletechnoscience, to which it reacts with all its forces. It is on the one hand globalization. It produces webs, exploits the capital and knowledge of telemediation. The resurgence of religion, therefore, is not the same as retour or recurrence. It is neither an archaic revival nor a counter-praxis to the trend towards secularization, and mounts to a formidable synergy between the power of the real and the deeper Lacanian sense, and a global Latinized communications and control system, which Derrida describes somewhat unfelicitously as telemediation. The telemediated religiosity is what social theorists have misnamed religious fundamentalism. The historical notion of fundamentalism implies a preoccupation with the literality of the sacred text, a concern that only arose in the West from the Enlightenment onward because of the epistemological conflicts generated by the struggle between natural philosophy and dogmatic supernaturalism. As historians of religion are beginning to notice, the fundamentalisms that are now springing up in other faith traditions have less to do with their Christian counterparts than meets the eye. Although Derrida's discourse has scant historicist subtlety, it strikes right into the solar plexus of religious theory, inasmuch as it identifies the anomalous affinity of postmodern religiosity for networks and rhizomes of communicative action, surpassing the purely textual. For that reason, the Capri conversations point toward a whole new modus vivendi for religious theory that is neither textualist nor critical-textualist. It is ironic that the gestation of this approach would come out of Derridian textualism and putting forth the trope of resurgence, and in putting forth the trope of resurgence, Derrida is acknowledging the severe limitations of his previous choric meditations, as well as the ultimate inconsequentiality of his own theologically popular program of postmodernist apophaticism. The Capri conversations can, of course, be compared with Derrida's meditations on religion and the gift of death. While the Capri conversations plot out the curious reciprocity of the symbolical and the real in the genesis of the religious, the gift of death underscores the incommensurability of finite and infinite to the concept of faith as responsibility, a uniquely, in Derrida's words, European innovation constituting a tradition, quote, that consists of proposing a non-dogmatic doublet of dogma, a philosophical and metaphysical doublet, in any case a thinking that repeats the possibility of religion without religion. The origin of such a religion without religion, which Caputo assigns to Derrida's own distinctive postmodern religiosity, is Kierkegaard's Knight of Faith, who beards the infinite demand of the holy other to sacrifice his own son, the heir to the promise, in contravention of the ethical universal. The well-known Kierkegaardian leap of faith is a gesture of pure singularity and fear and trembling, and hence by Derrida's reckoning is the threshold of categorical responsibility to both God and mysterium tremendum and the genuine neo-Kantian and neo-non-Hegelian ethical relationship to the other in Levinas's sense, is at the same time without mediation of any type, including the mediation of history. It is the logic of pure interiority. The secret truth of faith is absolute responsibility and absolute passion. The secret of faith, an intrinsically European innovation, as far as Derrida is concerned, contrasts with the pagan mysteries, with orgiastic absorption and rapture, as well as with the Platonic codes of representation and their dialectical asides. It is the Christian cipher to what messianically calls us beyond the traditions of theology and philosophy. The unspoken in Western thinking is not the unthought thought of being, as it is for Heidegger, but what can be adduced by considering the sign of Moriah. Abraham in his inarticulate and unaccountable trek up the mountain. All attempts at deconstructing the text of Western thought converge upon this sign, the sign of Moriah. The uniquely theological supplement for all these texts does not inhere in a sort of open-ended grammatological intervention or operation, as it does for the early Derrida, but in the crux of all representations, in the moment of sacrifice, in the gift of death, that Nietzsche understood as the reversal, if not the transversal, of the orgiastic, what Derrida terms the Christian repression. What Nietzsche and all other overdetermined readings of Christian history miss, according to Derrida, is the recognition that the all too familiar meta-narrative that might be termed the history of the faith is not so much a symptomatology of impotence and rage or raisonnement, as it is a meteor impact creating a grand instability within the grand economy of signs that we call Western religion and metaphysics. The so-called death of God is really the gift of death. The gift of the cross is a sign that the infinite cannot be exchanged or idolized. What Derrida has actually discovered in broad compass, if not at a global theoretical level, is the pervasive role of the paradoxical quality of faith as a deconstituting sign, as the grand design within the economy of all world religions. In other words, Derrida, through his deconstruction of the text of religion as the interiority of faith, introduces the power of the semiotic into any future religious theorizing. Derrida's Cora is a transitional term in the movement from negative theology or deconstructionism to a full-fledged semiotics of religion. Lacanian semiotics was always limited by the self-defined psychoanalytic application, and Zizek's cultural Lacanianism has always been tethered to a not-so-concealed political as well as polemical agenda. After postmodernism, religious theory must turn the strategy of difference into a global analysis of sign distinctions, sign functions, sign dynamics, sign relations, and full-scale sign movements and sign transpositions. The semiotic enterprise is not at all new. In the context of cultural theory, it has reached a kind of impasse because of its inability to disclose the fecundity and mobility of the signifying complexes and domains of culture with the same precision and consistency which, starting with Pyrrhus and evolving through Saussure and others, translated formal or mathematical logic into syntactical substitutions and correlations. But this semiological imperative can and must gain new life with the opening of the new territory of religious theory. This new territory, which I call, following Deleuze and his notion of a deterritorialized territory, I call Indian territory. Religious theory in the future will be viewed in deference to religious studies and religious thought as what psychoanalysis in the 20th century was to philosophical psychology and earlier genres of empirical psychology. In short, it will chart a topography of metaphors, terms, paradigms, etc., that include broad-scale codings of written tradition and observed moral ritual and other symbolical practices, as well as the interpenetration of these singular tokens by cultural waveforms that can be identified and schematized, if not resolved conceptually. The postmodern condition is not really a form of historicity. It is but a colorful carnival of multicultural and polymodal ways of rhetorically scoping and visualizing the virtual interplay of transient global artifactualities and, I borrow this term from Baudrillard, viralities of media and communications, of and their distinctive signifying processes and intensities with accelerating events around the planet. John Dealey, in his cumbersome yet trenchant survey of the history of philosophy, describes the slow and incremental emergence of a distinctive semiotic postmodernism. Quote, "For postmodern times and the immediate future of philosophy, the clear and central task is to come to terms with a universe perfused with signs," as Pyrrhus says, if not composed exclusively of them. After postmodernism and after Derrida, religious theory must begin to move in the same direction. And in the next chapter, which is would be the next presentation, I ask me for another presentation, but I move into Deleuze. Deleuze as a kind of premier postmodernist theoretician after postmodernism of the semiotic movement. This whole notion of nomadological deterritorializing and what he calls smooth spaces, which is really a kind of metaphorizing of post-structuralist semiotics, but applying post-structuralist semiotics to cultural history and to the global Latinizing panorama of culture that Derrida talks about. And in that second chapter, or second paper, I get into Deleuze's theory of the singular and of the singular event, and the way this can lead us into a kind of postmodern new semiotic way of approaching religious theory.
Thank you.
Yeah. When I read so fast, I end up spitting a little. But Deleuze spits all the time, so Zizek spits all the time. Anyway.
We have time for questions.
Yes.
So,
Can you tell me your name?
my name is Myra Bookman.
Okay.
So did Derrida admit to taking the term deconstruction from Bataille?
No, he said
Oh,
he did. He said he wrote Caputo back and said, "I never read read this in the time."
so it's simply a matter of intertextuality.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, I was struck by this historical irony that Rome is the origin of global Latinization, but Livy tells us the story of Rome being destroyed, and the destruction was so near total that many wanted to just relocate, and the priest said we can't because the gods are here.
Right.
And so so that key to Roman history is the idea of locality and the singular importance of locality for religion. I was wondering if it's possible for us to think religion in that way today. What I heard you describing as postmodernism at the end of the paper seemed not to go in that direction, to not want to engage that conception of locality for religion. But I couldn't tell really. So.
Well, yeah. I mean, he's how to call it Deleuzian locality, or the siting. That's the third spelling of the term, S-I-T-I-N-G. Because for Deleuze, there is no thought without a site. All thought is cited. There is no such thing as an abstract universalism, which is why Deleuze is so hard for philosophers to read, and why particular Anglo-American philosophers, they say, well, I finally got a hold of Derrida, but this just drives me crazy. I mean, this guy is writing, history, linguistics. He's talking about nomads. He's writing about literature. He's quoting from Proust. He's writing with Guattari on Oedipus, and then their last great work, which I think is the greatest of books, What is Philosophy? He really develops his own kind of metaphorical or metonymical language, in a sense, to do the history of philosophy. And his whole notion of the conceptual persona is based on the idea that there is no such thing as the concept in itself, the concept as the eidos, or having some kind of eternal location. It's all situated temporally, and he gets that from Bergson, but it's also situated global and spatially. So, I mean, you talk about the Roman Empire. I spent a lot of time off and on in my career kind of trying to get a sense of what the Roman Empire was all about, and now all this, attention to the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Where does this all come from, in a lot of ways? And in some ways, my reading of the Roman religious situation was it is very much like, I think Derrida is right, because in some ways we are in the age of empire. I mean, that's what, since the Iraq War, there are a lot of international theorists and philosophers. I'm predicting the next wave in postmodernism is all going to be Italian. And if you were, listening to all the trendsetters at the Syracuse conference and stuff, this guy, like Agamben and those people, these guys were all Italian. And Adamo, I don't have any great admiration for, his kind of, his star is rising too. So, what does this mean? Maybe Derrida and the Capri conversations kind of said it, but excuse me, Rome was, both a universal, but it was a strange sort of concrete universal empire, and this is why, Christians were persecuted. If you really look at the history of the struggle between Christ and Caesar, the only contention was, was throwing incense to the statue of Caesar. And what did that throwing of incense to the statue of Caesar mean? Well, it was a gesture of, civic loyalty, basically, expressing your, in a sense, your allegiance and accession to the universal, Hellenistic Mediterranean, Roman ideal, you see, of unity and diversity. Not conceptual unity, but a kind of loose diversity.
Right.
A loose unity and diversity. And we talk about multiculturalism, but the Romans invented multiculturalism. If not, the worst, the least savory forms of political correctness. And really the struggle between Christ and Caesar is between allegiance to transcendence and to what the early church considered the false and politically, correct universalism of Roman imperial religion. The gods were in the empire, but where is the empire? They were in Rome, but Rome was everywhere. In some ways, I think what Deleuze and the next generation, not the Italians, because Deleuze has really not been read and understood. He didn't have the gift for self-promotion that Derrida had, and now he's dead. There are some people, particularly in this country, beginning to discover what you can do with Deleuze. Deleuze is I predict, is going to be like Nietzsche, misunderstood for generations, and finally, like Nietzsche, who's really the kind of seedbed for, European postmodernism. It was Deleuze's book on Nietzsche that really started the whole post-structuralist, revolution in France. He's going to be that seedbed, because he really, he understands the dynamics of diversity and difference, and this is all about, sign production, desiring machines.
I'm not sure about my
By the way,
question.
could somebody give me another diet Sprite? My throat's kind of dry as I talk.
Yeah. How is, and I'm not sure I'm grasping, but how is the Deleuzian deterritorialization in some way he's invoking this category of the nomadism in the smooth space, unlimited expansion,
Real
freedom.
Sprite or Diet Pepsi?
You have any diet Sprites?
Not that I can see.
I'll take a diet Pepsi.
This kind of absolute freedom or purism almost of the nomadic cultures unencumbered by civilization, the cultures of the steppe running free in smooth space. How is this not a new form of colonialism, of cultural imposition of their absolutes on the cultures that they overrun? It's just a metaphor.
Well,
It's not
it gets
a
into the really
colonialism.
interesting question of what, in a lot of ways, it's almost an historical question, because, so much, I think Long is right, so much of colonial thinking is based on a kind of incipient Arianism, which comes from, 19th century romantic, what Very calls metapsychology, which in its more heinous forms led to, the propaganda of the Third Reich. This idea of a kind of ethnic, cultural sort of imperium, and of course you look at after the German barbarians overran the Roman Empire, they became the Holy Roman Empire, became Romanized, the only reasons that most of Europe remained Christian rather than becoming Muslim was because, the Germans were so, fierce, and they consider themselves heirs to the Roman Christian Empire, and they fought like hell against the Muslim invaders and terrorized.
The Mongols, peoples of the steppe land, aren't they a form of colonialism in their own way?
Well, but that's not really what colonialism means historically.
Sweeping away.
Barbarians. You have to get into what Deleuze really understands by the war machine, and the war machine is not a movement of conquest. It's the machinery of pure difference, of endless differentiation. you know, and there always is this kind of barbarism tendency in postmodernism, this kind of fascination with the barbaric and, you know, what comes from on the other side of the lumina. In fact, you know, I proudly wear the title of barbarian because in 1985 I was named by Nathan Scott, you know, as the president of the American Academy of Religion. I was named by name along with some people like Mark C. Taylor as being the new barbarians, you know, who were promoting postmodernism.
For me, complex.
Well, you know, there's several terms here, and you know, we've got to really examine our political categories a lot, because, you know, we talk about conquest, domination, you know, invasion, and that sort of thing. I mean, would you call, you know, what's going on the borders of America, the browning of America, as it's called? I mean, our own kind of global Latinization, the surge that's coming from the South, you know, which historically was in many ways just like what was happening in the Roman Empire. Would you call that conquest? I don't think so. You know, because these were, you know, formerly subjugated people, but, you know, so were the Germans. You know, in the 4th century, so were the Goths. You know, they were, quote, subjugated people, but as Deleuze, I think, pointed, it's not about domination and conquest. This is why sort of Foucaultian hermeneutics of power is, I think, had its day. You know, it's about difference. It's about, you know, in a sense, you know, it's about you know, overcoming Oedipal structures and structures of authority and structures of a tradition and structures of precedence. You know, it's about blurring the lines. You know, I mean, ironically, the deterritorialization is taking place, you know, increasingly and massively in the American Southwest, is another epoch, a cycle of deterritorialization that the you know, Spanish conquest was. You know, and you know, as it was the formation of Latin American culture, it was conquest, it was domination, it was class ridden, but at the same time, it was also cultural syncretism. You know, I mean, there is this kind of longing for, you know, for La Raza, you know, you know, who is La Raza? Is it the Aztecs? You know, is it the Spaniards? I mean, this is what deterritorialism means. It's not.
When you speak of absolute difference, can I get a clearer sense of difference between what and what?
Pardon?
Difference between what and what, the absolute difference as opposed to.
I didn't understand the question.
Well, you speak, it's
It
not
sounded
about
like
conquest, it's about
presupposing a kind of Hegelian answer, which I'm not going to give.
Okay, all right. So what's your sense of this difference then, as opposed to not?
Well, in fact, I think to be clear, see, I mean, Derrida did this with difference. If you think about difference, it was a key concept, you know, because it was, you know, it was phonetic, and it was also, you know, graphic. You know, the changing of the E to A, you know, which sounds the same but spelled different, and that was the kind of, you know, linchpin for the, you know, the whole, you know, movement of deconstruction. To realize that, you know, somehow meaning is changed by a spacing, by just, you know, by the change of letter, and it sounds the same. This whole, you know, attack on phonologocentry, and so he, you know, he took this kind of, you know, garden variety philosophical idea of difference, you know, which Hegel, you know, gave forward to. But when, if you know, if you look at Hegel's real agenda, you know, Hegel was, you know, only interested in difference. I'm convinced because he really was after identity. You know, he just wanted to come up with a more stable form of identity. Because the Hegelian state is really the state the nomads overrun in Deleuze's terms. But you know, the war machine is about the production of difference, and then really difference becomes a verb, becomes the power of difference. The machinics of difference, always producing difference. You know, what do we get when we, you know, what do we get when we get difference? More difference, which is different than the whole question of diversity or multiplicity. Which is why I think people like Badiou are trying to somehow, by the definition, re-Platonize postmodernism. So we'll have a nice kind of formal sort of, you know, Republic of Plato where difference is more ordered. You know, I don't know if anybody here is
Red Badu, he's kind of looming on the horizon, but his whole thing about, the truth procedures in philosophy, we need difference, but not this kind of radical production of difference. We get difference so that we can, get our new postmodern Platonism. Yeah.
You caution us that Deleuze will be, or probably will be, misunderstood for holistic account. But I'm
It
kind of...
has to be.
I mean, it has to be.
I hope you misunderstood what I had to say. If you didn't, you didn't.
I didn't understand a single word, actually.
Good.
I'm not afraid to say that. But I'm personally, I come from a background that I'm very interested in linguistics theory and the idea that the mechanics and the consequences and the symbology that can be collapsed in language. So where would an undergraduate go to start his inquiry with Deleuze if he was interested?
Start reading Deleuze, and I would say read, if you want a curriculum for Deleuze, start with Anti-Oedipus. The books he wrote with Guattari, during his pop phase. Start there. You kind of get a sense of where he is. I mean, you will understand it. It sounds great, and then go back and read his book, which was actually the book that made him famous as a philosopher. His book Nietzsche, which is you got to understand a little bit about Nietzsche. And it's a kind of strange reading of Nietzsche, but it's about Nietzsche. And then there are a lot of ways you can go. I would say then read something like 1,000 Plateaus. I think 1,000 Plateaus is his greatest work. It's all over the board. It's like Hegel's phenomenology. It's this kind of grand sweep of everything. It's obscure like Hegel's phenomenology is, but it's like listening to the Ninth Symphony. Read it over and over. He's got stuff in there on nomads, the history of civilization. He's got stuff in there on chaos science, his incipient phase when he wrote it in the late 80s. He's got stuff on there on, histories of sexuality. He's got everything in there. It's a pure French treatise, on everything. And then if you really want to kind of get the grand vision of Deleuze, read What is Philosophy? It sounds like, just like a history of philosophy textbook, or the kind of thing you do in a Philosophy 101. I would. But, I used it for, I threw it into my graduate seminar, and these people didn't have background in philosophy. They really got into it this past fall. It's like when you get a sense of what it's doing, it kind of reads the results.
You mentioned, I think I wrote this down right, you mentioned the redistribution of knowledge in a negative space as far as its production and maintenance is where new knowledge is at least incubated. Do you find that there's space for that in theological inquiry? I mean, at least insofar as the cultures that seem to be re-embracing what may or may not be fundamentalism seem to be diametrically opposed, and I'm wondering where you would see that there would be some type of negative space that these different cultures could traffic in.
Well, the negative space is being created by the kind of counterpole between these different fundamentalisms. I mean, I don't like the word fundamentalism as a theoretical term. Martin Marty started out in this fundamentalism project because he was trying to, metaphorically apply the history of Christian Protestant fundamentalism to, what were really sort of, traditionalist movements. I mean, would you call, Hindu nationalism and that kind of assertion of Hinduism, which, when I was in college was supposed to be the great ironic, peaceful religion of tolerance and acceptance. I mean, the notion of Hindu fundamentalism just sounds like an oxymoron, but there it is, tied in with nationalism. And one of my colleagues, Ginny Shimatsu, who was
student of internationalism, and she just agrees that the term fundamentalism doesn't really apply. Even the term fundamentalism doesn't really apply to Islam, even though again we use it. We talk about Islamic terrorism and fundamentalism, and as one Islamic scholar pointed out, it's just kind of silly to be talking this way, because if fundamentalism is used to mean what it originally meant, that is belief in the literal truth of the text, then you can't be a Muslim and not be a fundamentalist, because the absolute, textual, to the letter truth of the Quran is kind of an anchor belief for Muslims. You don't have to believe in the literal truth of the Bible to be a Christian, but you do to be a Muslim. And so, so there's that kind of association with violence and so forth. But there's no, there's no evidence that just because you take a text literally means you're going to be violent. I mean, that's just crazy. What's happening is that you're seeing this kind of reaction worldwide to the Enlightenment. I mean, look what's happening in the Catholic Church. Look what's happening in the Episcopal Church. I mean, where is the quote movement of conservatism, which is horrifying us? It was said about the appointment of Benedict XVI to Ratzinger, saying, well, there was just a German coup, and, an effort to to kind of maintain the hegemony of Europe. And what they're finding out is that it was basically we used to call the Third World was behind Ratzinger. Why? Because he was going to keep, the traditional faith. It's a reaction against, European cosmopolitanism and colonialism. I mean, face it, folks, I know this is probably going to stone me when I say this, but the Enlightenment ideal of liberal academia, that we all subscribe to and we tut-tut when everybody challenges this, is what's really being challenged by global Latinization. The history is with the quote fundamentalists, not with the Enlightenment. And I think Derrida is, the point. And a lot of what's happening right now is very much like what was happening in the 5th century, with the fall of Rome, intellectually as well as culturally.
Although you could say that fundamentalism as such is an attempt to reduce the complexity of religion to certain fundamental parts. Fundamentalism in that sense.
That's what it meant in the original sense.
Yeah.
And
that's
I have a trivia question I always throw out at parties. And where did fundamentalism start? And I said, well, it must have been among Southern Baptists in Appalachia in the 1930s, after the Scopes trial. I said, no, it started at Princeton University in the 1890s. The first fundamentalists were Princeton philosophers and theologians, British empiricists who also wanted to believe in the Bible. That's where the term fundamentalism comes from. So-called fundamentals of Christianity.
Okay.
It presupposes the Enlightenment, right?
Yeah, it was a reaction against.
And if you're interested in all this kind of stuff in American religion, I'll recommend my latest book to you, which is called Next Reformation by Baker Academic Books, which is probably the hottest selling book I've ever written, because all the evangelicals are buying it up. And basically what I'm saying is, in the book is that I trace their own history, their own genealogy. I said, what we call fundamentalism, and what, the defense of, the truth of the Bible and Christianity. I said, this is just all enlightenment stuff. It's about, I said, if you want to liberate evangelical faith, read Derrida, read Deleuze. In fact, this weekend I'm going to be down in Texas giving a talk to Criswell Seminary students. They bought